Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Charlotte McNamara and I am Head of the Health and Breeding Department at the Kennel Club. I'm really pleased to have Dr Alison Skipper with us this evening for our talk. Alison is the Veterinary and Research Advisor at the Kennel Club, and she's here today to provide us with a historical overview of the development of closed breed registers. Alison really needs no introduction. She's been involved in pedigree dog health for over 30 years. She has a dual background in both first opinion veterinary practice and in research, having previously worked as a researcher at the Royal Veterinary College. She also holds a PhD in the history of breed-related disease in pedigree dogs. Before we begin this evening, I just want everybody to be aware that you will not be able to speak during this webinar. So please don't raise your hand. We will be welcoming questions at the end of the webinar. We have already received a lot of questions in advance, so thank you for those. But if you do think of anything during the session, you can submit these via the Q&A feature at the top of the screen. The full recording of this evening's webinar will be available at absolutely no cost on the Kennel Club's YouTube channel. So if you have enjoyed the webinar, please do put this on your social media channels or promote this to friends or those in the community that might have an interest in this area. You can also find previous health-related webinars on our YouTube channel, so please do go and take a look at those. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm now pleased to hand over to Alison. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you. So I wanted to start by just very briefly going over my background because it is unusual and it does impact what I bring to this webinar. So I started off going to vet school at the normal sort of stage of life as a school leaver, spent 25 years in general practice with a lot of grassroots pedigree dog health work on the side, and then went back to university for another 7 years to do a master's and then a PhD in the history of breed-related disease in pedigree dogs, funded by the Wellcome Trust, followed by a couple of years at the Royal Veterinary College, and then coming to the Kennel Club, as Charlotte said. So I have an unusual, though not completely unique, skill set in that I'm dually professionally trained as both a veterinarian and a historian. There are 3 of us with those dual qualifications in the whole of the UK. So many of you will have come to Dr. Joanna Ilska's webinar a month ago. She managed the technology better than I did. And she also did a great job of describing some very technical concepts in genetics in a way that was accessible and understandable. This webinar is basically history, not science, although it will include some history of science. And so on the whole, I hope that people will find that more accessible, those of you who don't have a scientific background. We know that the audience today includes a lot of dog breeders, some scientists, some vets, some campaigners, and other people who are just interested in dogs. So I hope that all of you will find the content interesting. There's just one piece of historical jargon that I want you to learn, and that is the concept of presentism, which, as you can see here, is the application of present-day ideas or perspectives to depictions or interpretations of the past. Now, in case you can't guess from the definition, presentism is bad. Presentism for historians is when we distort our understanding of the past by looking at it from a perspective that's too informed from where we are today. Or to put it another way, in this famous quote from L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. And we very often tend to interact with the past in quite a superficial way. For example, if people are enjoying an activity like medieval reenactment, they probably are learning something about history, and the audience that comes to see them is probably also learning something about history. But nobody would really think that dressing up as a Norman knight on a sunny bank holiday weekend is anything like it actually would have been to be in a battle in medieval times, or that to experience this tells you anything really about what it would have been like, how people would have thought and lived in medieval society. And yet we sort of think something that long ago is so different that we can't really access it. But when you think about it, the more recent past was also very different from today. So those of you who are younger listening to this probably think of this as a retro, quaint sort of telephone. For those of us who are more my sort of age, this is what a telephone was when we were young, right? It wasn't quaint or interesting. It was just a phone. That's what they were, and that's what they did. And when this was a telephone, if you think about it, society worked completely differently. When I was a teenager, if I went into town and my friends weren't at the place I expected to meet them at, there wasn't really a lot I could do about it. Maybe they'd turn up in a few minutes. Maybe I could find a call box and ring their parents and see if they knew what had happened. But if none of those things worked, we all just had to go home again. And similarly, when this is what a phone was, and there was no public internet, how did you find out about a new special interest like medieval armour or canine genetics? Maybe you could get a book from a bookshop, maybe you could go to a library. But if you didn't find anything in those places, or once you'd exhausted those places, there was no free access to other sources of information as we are so used to today. Society worked completely differently. And similarly, society was totally different in what was socially acceptable. So again, if you're old enough to remember aeroplane flights in the early 1990s or before, you will remember when smoking on planes was socially acceptable. And if you wanted to go to the toilet mid-flight, you had to sort of navigate that blue haze bit at the back. Whereas then in the late 1990s, around 2000, when this became illegal in various countries, suddenly that went from being socially acceptable to socially unacceptable. Before that time, if you'd stood up and shouted about how much you hated smoking on a flight, you'd have been breaking the social codes. After that time, if you'd started smoking on a flight, you would have been the one breaking the social codes. So things can change totally in quite a short time, and yet we very soon forget what things were like before. So what's this got to do with dog breeding? You've dealt with the technical issues, you've dealt with me talking about what other things totally unconnected with dogs. What did you sign up for with this webinar? Well, the reason I talked about those things is to explain the concept of presentism, because I want to make the point that common current beliefs about dog breeding history are very largely not right. So most people, many people think that pedigree dog breed registers have always been closed, that current pedigree dog breeding practices date from Victorian times, that pedigree dog breeding has always been based on inbreeding because these breeders just didn't care about health, and that dog breeders resist change and don't care about science. And I'm going to be making the point during this webinar that these perspectives are very much presentist, and to a large extent, they're false, that the history of this world is not necessarily what you think it is. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going on a field trip into the past together. Some of the content will be unexpected, but I'd really like us all to try to think like historians, insofar as I would like us all not to try not to patronize or judge the past from a position of today's knowledge and values while we're thinking about it. Because if we do that, we're doing the people of the past a disservice, because they stood in their own particular point in history, just as we stand in our point in history in 2025. Before I get going, I just want to make one more note. I know some of you are international, and I'm really glad you've come, and I hope you enjoy this webinar. But my research is exclusively British. I didn't study the archives of other kennel clubs. Now, both because the UK Kennel Club was the first kennel club globally, and also because we're Anglophone and of the historical influence of the British Empire at the time that I'm largely talking about, it's very likely that other countries' early histories will be similar in many ways, but they will also differ according to their own national contexts. And it would be really useful and helpful for other people to do similar research in their own countries. The one thing I would say is any such research needs to involve the administrative records, because people don't always do what they say they're doing in the books and the magazines. And it's only when you get down to the fine detail of the records that you can see what was actually going on, as we will see. Okay, so we're going to start by going back to a time before formal breed registers to just revisit what was happening in the earlier days before dog shows became a thing. So, of course, people have been selectively breeding different types or kinds of dog for thousands of years for different purposes. And this page from the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1797 gives you a very good idea of the sorts of ways that types or kinds of dog were viewed at that time. So you can see there's some types that are familiar to us, like the Dalmatian or the Bulldog, though it looks very different, and others that we don't have anymore, like the Turnspit, or very vague categories like a Spaniel. And at that time, these types or kinds of dog were defined very loosely. So a Dalmatian was a spotted carriage dog, for example. But that doesn't mean, of course, that dogs weren't bred deliberately in different populations for different purposes. And if you look at something like this group of foxhounds painted by George Stubbs in 1762, if you know anything about dogs, it's obvious, of course, that these dogs must be related and would have been owned by a big landowner for his own hunting purposes, and very likely the foxhound pack of another different big landowner would have looked slightly different and would have been a separate population. And similarly, crossbreeding is not a new concept. So here's a quote from over 400 years ago describing a crossbreed as a cross between two types of dog. And this image of a little dog from nearly 300 years ago. Of course, we don't know how this dog was bred, but I just chose this picture because I think it's interesting how like a modern designer crossbreed, a Cavachon or something, this little dog looks. But if we want to imagine how this world was before modern breed, I think for those of us in the UK, a really good way to do so is just think about lurchers, because lurchers are still a type or a kind in this way. We all know what a lurcher is. It's a sort of sighthoundy dog that might be largely like a greyhound or a whippet, but is also perhaps crossed with something else like a collie or a Bedlington, or it might be bred from other lurchers. And when I asked for images of lurchers to illustrate this webinar on a veterinary Facebook group I belong to, I sort of started off an accidental lurcher photo show in which people submitted loads of images of lurchers, but they were really varied. But of course, nobody could say, well, this one isn't a good one, or this one isn't a typical one, because lurchers don't have breed standards or breed registers. And that's the key things, of course, that differentiate pedigree dogs from other dogs, is that they have breed standards and they have breed registers. And if we're thinking about how that differentiation came to be, we need to start really with the changes that followed the agricultural revolution in the UK in the end of the 18th century, where this man, Robert Bakewell, and his associates started a new type of deliberate selective breeding. So, of course, people had selectively bred livestock before, but what was new was that they started breeding in a controlled way by deliberate inbreeding, record keeping and selection to produce, for example, cows with higher milk yields or meat animals with higher carcass weights. And of course, people being what they are, these new types of selectively bred livestock quickly became a vehicle for people to be competitive and display how skillful they'd been at agricultural shows, which was facilitated by the fact that better transport networks were also developing in the UK at this time as road surfaces improved and the railways were developed. And so the concept of the agricultural show came into being. Meanwhile, in urban settings, people were also becoming more competitive with their dogs. This early urban canine fancy, which is captured in this famous painting in the Kennel Club's art gallery, shows a rather different world of male-only gatherings and informal competitions. You can see in the walls in the paintings on the walls in this painting, some depictions of rat killing competitions, and very likely these people were competing with the physical appearance of these dogs that they've brought with them. But you will see that many of these don't belong to any apparent breed because this is before there were breeds in the way we think about them. And these two strands of animal competition came together from 1859 onwards with the birth of the modern dog show as we think of it now. And initially, these were part of the Midlands agricultural shows I've just described, but they were very quickly so popular that a national standalone show circuit soon emerged, and new dog shows like the one that you see in this picture were developed for the first time. But obviously, it became very quickly apparent to people that if you're going to compare dogs and win prizes, you need to have some sort of standard of comparison. And that's why the first breed standard for the pointer was developed in 1865, with many others following shortly afterwards. And so this is my first key point, that breed standards came first. Breed standards came before breed registers. And if you're interested in all this and you haven't read it, I recommend The Invention of the Modern Dog by Michael Warboys, Julie Marie Strange, and Neil Pemberton, which describes this world up to about 1900 in great detail based on their research in the Kennel Club archive. And they make this really good simile, which I think is a really helpful way of thinking about it, that before modern breed, defined and separated by breed standards, you can think of different types of dog a bit like this paint wheel at the top, that yes, you can say this bit is blue, this bit is a greyhound, but exactly where this merges into purple, which might be some other kind of dog, is difficult to say. Whereas the bottom image shows a paint card, and even though two shades of blue or two breeds of dog might be very similar, nevertheless, they're clearly defined as different from each other. So this brings us to the foundation of the Kennel Club in 1873, as probably pretty much everybody here knows. What we don't necessarily all know is that this wasn't the only way the world might have turned out, because the Kennel Club were the winners of the power struggle to control this emerging system, as a number of different organisations realised that the new proliferation of shows needed some sort of regulation and standardisation if they were to work in an organised way. And so the group of men who founded the Kennel Club consciously modelled themselves on the Jockey Club, the association that ran English thoroughbred horse racing, because this was an aspirational thing to do. And their stated aims were the general improvement of dogs, dog shows, and canine trials. And of course, they quickly set about establishing their authority on this new world by issuing show rules and regulations under which compliant shows had to run, as they still do today. They coordinated and regulated the various breed clubs, many of which had already sprung into being. They established dog shows as a socially respectable pastime for the first time, where, for example, women could go. And they began the stud book to aid the improvement of dogs. Now, one point I want to make, and I know Joanna Ilska in the audience will be smiling, is that Kennel Club stud books are not the same as breed registers. I gather that probably in some other countries people call the breed register the stud books, and people in this country do it all the time. I do it myself occasionally, sometimes when I'm not concentrating still. But it's a really key point, because breed registers in the UK developed as a separate thing from the stud book. So the first stud book was produced in 1874 and accumulated the data from the previous 15 years since the first modern dog show had been started. One man was literally given the job of going around and asking everybody what they'd been doing from the last 15 years and putting it in this book. And it had two sections. The first section recorded all the past shows and field trials and who'd won them. And the second section gave the brief pedigrees of these winning dogs and gave them each a stud book number, which was intended to serve as a sort of benchmark of quality for posterity. And indeed, that system is still used today. However, and this is a key point, this system was never comprehensive. It couldn't be comprehensive because by definition, it only included winning dogs. You couldn't be in the stud book unless you'd won a prize, which meant it was never going to include every single dog that appeared in the show ring. And also, by definition, it was always retrospective because you couldn't be in the stud book until you'd won something, so that it was never going to be effective as a guide for the dogs that were upcoming. What's more, duplicate names were allowed and name changes were possible. So just to show how confusing that was, on this slide, I show the 29 entries in this first stud book for pointers that were called Don. Some of them are the same dog with different owners. The first one at the top of the bigger image was previously called Knockdown. And you can see that in a system like this, where multiple dogs can have the same name and name changes are completely free, it's really not a very good way of keeping track of what's actually happening. And it was for this reason that the Registry of Names was introduced in 1880. It so happened that the Kennel Club had recently acquired a monthly journal called the Kennel Gazette, which was obviously a much more suitable way to publish information that you need to have updated regularly. And so what they did was require that all dogs that were going to be exhibited in Kennel Club shows going forwards had to be listed in the Registry of Names each month. And they also said that there should be no duplicate names within a breed and that all changes of name should be recorded. However, pedigree information was then still fully optional. And you can see that on this Smooth Fox Terrier excerpt, that the top entry and another one lower down both say pedigree unknown. This was a fully open registry system, and it would stay that way for 30 or more years, because it was centred on tracing what was being exhibited in the show ring, not on recording pedigrees or breeding. And you can see this point really nicely with this next image, which is foreign dogs from 1889. So this is all the breeds that didn't currently then have their own breed registers in the UK. So, for example, what we would now call Dr Bordeaux would have been in here, for example. But if you look down these entries, you can see that they include the name of the owner and the name of the dog. They very usually don't include any pedigree information. And if you actually think about it, they don't include the breed of the dog. Presumably, the judge just had to sort that out in the show ring when all these dogs appeared in the foreign dogs class, perhaps with the aid of the catalogue. But this really underlines how much this system wasn't about pedigree. It was simply about keeping track of what was being shown. And that wasn't really an issue, because breeding records were still expected to be largely private, kept by breeders together or independently to support their own good breeding practices. And that wasn't an issue because of how good breeding was understood at that time. And so at this point, we're just going to make our first brief detour into the history of heredity, because it's really important to understand the history of heredity in order to understand why these people were doing what they were doing. And at this point, they understood heredity in the way that historians of science call soft heredity, in terms of pure breeding and blood. Now, those terms sound familiar to all of us who are interested in animal breeding, but in just the same way as what we mean by a phone now isn't really the same thing as we meant by a phone in 1975 or 1980, what we mean by pure breeding and blood now is not how they understood those terms or used those terms in the late Victorian era, because they understood heredity in such a different way. They thought of purebred dogs as those that were rich in good blood. That's what pure breeding meant. And blood was the material of heredity. We talk now about bloodlines and blood stock in horses, but for them, blood was literally the material of heredity by which inherited characteristics were transmitted between generations, except that they didn't really know then exactly how that was happening, because they didn't know about chromosomes or DNA, obviously. So they knew it happened somehow, obviously, because greyhounds produce greyhounds and cows produce cows. But exactly what was going on, they didn't know. And this is why it's called the soft understanding of heredity, because it was very nebulous and very vague. Blood to these people was a really broad concept. They also, of course, believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which I'll come on to. So external influences also played into heredity. And therefore, the good blood that these dogs had could be proved in many very flexible ways. So here are some sources of canine good blood at the time. So a long pedigree was a good thing. And you can see on this Clumber Spaniel example from 1889 that I think it traces back about 10 generations in the middle of the pedigree, which is a good thing, because that proves that they've been being bred selectively for a long time. A famous foundation ancestor is an obvious source of good blood, and I'll come on to that in the next slide. But so also are ancestors with prestigious owners by a sort of reflected glory. So you see on this pedigree, for example, that one of the dogs near the top was owned by the Duke of Portland, and there's a couple more lower down that I can't read because it's too small, that were aristocrats of various kinds. And there are also breeders listed here who weren't aristocratic, but had reputations within the breed for being skilled breeders. So there's Mr. Arkwright at the top, who was a famous gun dog breeder. And these names are included on this pedigree because they add the authenticity of good blood. Then, of course, show or trial success confers good blood, and that's why many of these dogs have got stud book numbers listed after their names. If you knew these dogs personally, then of course you would know about the desirable attributes they had, whatever they were, which conferred good blood. And you would also know about any familial consistency or the prepotency of any sires in the pedigree, which were themselves also considered evidence of good blood. And then in good blood was both proved and maintained by inbreeding, or sometimes what we would think of as pure breeding, as in breeding within a restricted population, but not to the same extent that we generally think of it more recently. And again, you can see that if you look in the middle of this pedigree, you can see a Foljambe bitch. So Foljambe was a famous breeder of Clumber Spaniels. And particularly since it's a bitch, nobody's too bothered necessarily about exactly which bitch this is. It's good enough that she came from a famous breeder. So I said on the previous slide that famous ancestors were a really strong source of good blood. And this dog, Arkham, who is believed to be the ancestor of all Pekingese in the West today, is the classic example of this. I know, of course, that he doesn't look anything like modern Pekingese, and that's a conversation for another time that we're not going to go into today. But Arkham was a particularly exciting example of good blood because he was smuggled out of the imperial palace in what was then called Peking. So he had all the glamour and mystique of royalty and of the East and all these other things, and was therefore extensively inbred on in order to concentrate this good blood. And so here you see his great-granddaughter, Chi Li. But if you look at the pedigree, you can see that he is all of her great-grandfathers, because she's the product of half-brother, half-sister matings, followed by full brother, full sister matings, inbreeding really deliberately, really heavily on Arkham, which was at the time reckoned as the way to preserve and concentrate his excellent blood. But inbreeding could also take more complicated and less direct routes, because there was also thought to be great skill in how breeders concentrated and reproduced blood between generations, with various familial formulas for inbreeding. So this dog, a Scottish Terrier bitch called Sunray, if you look at the first 3 generations of her pedigree, there are no common ancestors. But you can see that she also has a really high coefficient of inbreeding because of inbreeding on 2 sires that I've marked here, Champion Alistair and Champion Dundee, who are themselves half brothers, and one is the grandfather of the other, and the one that is the grandfather is the product of the sibling mating. So there's really complicated layers and ramifications of inbreeding, which was all deliberate in order to maintain this good blood. And the reason they were so anxious to maintain good blood was because it was ever threatened by the, to them, very real risk of acquired influences that would distort and compromise these hereditary influences. So, for example, at the end of the 19th century, pretty much everybody believed in telegony. So telegony is the idea that if, for example, as in this picture, you mate a mare to a zebra and she has a stripy foal, as you might expect, then if subsequently you mate her to a horse stallion, the subsequent foals will also be a bit stripy because she'll retain some influence from the zebra that mated her previously. And this slide image is from some very famous experiments that were carried out in the 1890s to disprove this theory, when they did exactly this, and the mare's subsequent foals to another horse were not stripy. But at the time we're talking about, telegony was still very widely accepted. Almost a sort of direct contradiction to that was the idea of saturation, the idea that if you repeatedly mated a bitch to the same dog, then the subsequent litters would somehow become oversaturated with his influence so that they would be inferior to the first ones that she'd had by him. Then there was a very general belief in the adverse impact of environmental influences of all sorts. So if an animal or a person experienced disease of some sort during their lifetime, that could be transmitted to their descendants, or adverse environmental influences such as living in an industrialized society or being taken away from the environment that your race ought to live within were also going to be potentially problematic. So, for example, collies, what we would now generally call rough collies, were really popular in the 1890s, and there was a very real fear that the simple act of not having them living in the highlands anymore, but moving them to urban centres, would cause degeneration through the adverse impact of the industrialised urban setting rather than living in the hills, irrespective of what breeding decisions you made. And then people were also worried about maternal impressions. And if your pregnant bitch is frightened by a black and white cow, then maybe she'll produce black and white puppies when she wouldn't have done so otherwise, for example. And so good breeding around 1900 was very much a balance between maintaining the good blood through inbreeding, with having obtained the good blood in all these ways I've described, to counteract all these acquired adverse influences. And yet they did know that inbreeding was a two-edged sword. It was necessary to perpetuate and protect and preserve and concentrate good blood. With selection, it would fix the desired qualities that you were breeding for, whatever they might be. It would protect against these acquired influences, but they knew that it ran a recognised risk of degeneration, which was a massive concern at that time because it was also a massive concern in society more generally. So this image here is from a cartoon from 1880, where you see this sort of idea playing out with concerns in human society. The idea is that these two parents who might very well be first cousins, as was quite popular at the time in particularly upper class families, maybe ought to have thought more carefully before they produced this son who is being depicted as degenerate and problematic because he's depicted as an aesthete, part of the aesthetic movement, people like Oscar Wilde, who were, of course, effeminate and terribly problematic at the time. So this idea of degeneration as a result of bad choices in heredity was a massive preoccupation in Victorian society more broadly, which of course spilled over absolutely into the animal breeding world. Fortunately, however, if they were worried about the downside of inbreeding, that wasn't a problem on one level because they could outcross and crossbreed if they needed to. So because this was an open registry system, there was a penumbra of non-show dogs of a breed that could be freely used, that were freely available. And if you look at the quotes in the archives at this time, you see them actively talking about this. So I've put a couple of quotes up here, a breeder talking about literally going on field trips to, this is a sort of upper class woman talking about literally going on field trips to the East End of London, to the slums, to look for pugs to buy and bring into her breeding program. And another breeder of Old English sheepdogs, what they call bobtails, who was discussing some sort of concern in the breed at the time and saying that we could go and pick up a dog without a pedigree in order to use him for outcrossing. So this was perfectly acceptable. And so too, up to a point, was crossbreeding. So there was a very famous anecdote told at a Kennel Club meeting in 1899 to underline the point that it was appearance, as in breed standards, that denoted the breed of a dog, not pedigree, of one litter that was half registered as collies and the other half as greyhounds, simply on the basis of their physical appearance. And people knew and argued that deliberate crossbreeding to other breeds could be a useful tool in the breeder's armoury, which, as I put in that quote, would often prove valuable. There were people who argued against this, and certain individual crossbreeding requests were refused by the Kennel Club towards the end of the 19th century, and therefore they introduced a new process for this from 1906 onwards, a special crossbreed register with a two-generation process. So you see here a stud advert for a crossbreed bloodhound otterhound from 1907, who had a stud book number because of his field trial performance, and as you see here, was advertised at stud for use on bloodhound bitches to improve qualities if the bloodhound breeder was worried about losing these in their line. And so this dog would have been on the crossbreed register. If you'd used him at stud to your bloodhound bitch, then that generation of puppies would also have been on the crossbreed register, but then his grandchildren could have been put back on the purebred bloodhound register. So this is the way that system worked at that time. And of course, despite this protocol, there were in practice still very few restrictions because it was an open registry system anyway. So if you wanted to do some crossbreeding in the background and then bring a bitch without a pedigree or a dog without a pedigree onto the register a generation or two later, who would have said anything different anyway? So breed registers started to change from 1909 as pedigree became more important as the system evolved. And this is largely because pedigree dogs had at this point become a prestige trade and commercially valuable. This was the case both within the UK and also internationally. And you see here an advert from 1910. As I said earlier, collies were a really popular breed at this time. And this just shows you the sort of trade networks that were in place. This was a very famous collie kennel in Southport on the west coast of England, with trade links to a sort of satellite kennel in New Jersey, from which dogs were then sent out all over North America to both the USA and Canada. And this was far from the only enterprise of this kind. And of course, if you're in this sort of system where you're running a lucrative trade, registration was a valuable tool to provide evidence of pedigree, which was compromised by unregistered parentage. And this was actually a particular problem in collies because a lot of collie unregistered dogs, which of course could still have duplicated names, did in fact have very similar names. There are a lot of collie bitches at this time, unregistered parents called things like Floss and Nell, and who's to know which of those is which? I don't know if you noticed, but on the Clumber Spaniel pedigree I showed a few slides ago, there were some duplicated names between generations. And when there are duplicated names, that allows ambiguity and fraud, which was also a problem in the UK show ring when these pedigrees weren't fully authenticated. And so in 1909, this was still a fully open registry, but the very first change came into place with the very simple expedient of listing a requirement that you had to list unregistered parents of registered dogs in italic type. So unfortunately, because I can't see the slides full size, I'm going to struggle to read these names. But dog, I do know some of them pretty well. Dog number 1, I think, is called Gateacre Bubbles at the top there. And you can see that both his parents are registered. They're both in normal type. Dog number 2, the sire, Black Jet, was not registered. He's in italic type. Dog number 3, it's the dam, is it Granville Grassville Queen, that's in italic type. Dog number 4, both parents were unregistered. They're both in italic type. And dog number 5, we don't even know who the parents are. Its pedigree and date of birth unknown. But it's just worth stressing, this is still a fully open registry system. Dog number 5 is just as entitled to be there as dog number 1, and if dog number 5 had been made a champion in the show ring, that would have been completely fine. And this is just a little insight to the sort of proportions that we have of registered and unregistered dogs at this time. So this is me counting all the Pomeranians in the registry in 1913. There were just under 2,000 of them, as you can see. And you can see that just over a third of them had 2 registered parents. About half, the mother was unregistered. Not many have just an unregistered father, but a substantial proportion, more than 10%, have both parents unregistered. And it would be wrong to suggest that these unregistered mothers were generally completely unrelated to the core population. Of course, they weren't. A lot of them were showbred bitches that just weren't exhibited in the show ring and therefore weren't registered. But there were also a substantial number of dogs that you can see from the names are unconnected to the sorts of leading show kennels and are genuinely coming from a less closely related population, very likely. So at this point, we're going in our second brief detour into the history of heredity, because in the background, meanwhile, there have been some substantial changes going on in the development of science. First of all, technology has moved on, and by this point they have developed very much better microscopes, which means that scientists have been able to see chromosomes during cell division for the first time and have realized that chromosomes are the physical location where this mysterious material of heredity that wasn't previously understood is situated. And they've been able to see cells undergoing meiosis and realize that there's something weird going on there, that this is the material of heredity dividing. And at the same time, of course, Mendel's work has been rediscovered. So we all learnt about Mendel's experiments with peas in school and how he did this work in the 1850s. And we're at the point now at the beginning of the 20th century where this work was rediscovered and slotted together with the new information about chromosomes to realize that the material of heredity can be packaged into what they called factors and we would call genes or alleles, and passed between generations in these little discrete units. And this meant which was an absolutely transformative moment for them, that heredity could be separated from environment for the first time, so that all those acquired influences that I mentioned earlier were no longer thought to influence the material of heredity passing between generations at all. Now, of course, actually we now think that that isn't totally true because of epigenetics. We know that what an individual experiences in their lifetime can influence the way that that genes work from one generation to the next by switching them on and off. But at that time, they didn't think this. They thought that heredity and the experiences of an individual in their lifetime were totally and utterly separate, which was completely different from what had been thought previously. And therefore, and this is really important for us, pure breeding radically changed in meaning. As they came to think of heredity in terms of factors or genes rather than blood, pure breeding stopped being something that you proved by looking backwards at the blood of the ancestors to becoming something that you proved by looking forwards at the similarity of the progeny and how much they had been selected to resemble each other. The key point for pure breeding became lack of variation. And you can see that in this early experiment on beans, where they're measuring the attributes of different pure lines of inbred beans and showing how they deliberately selected for things that are different from each other. And so at this point, we're talking about the sort of 1920s-ish by now, you're getting the rise of pure lines and commercial hybrids in agriculture, where people were deliberately breeding plants and to some extent animals, particularly chickens, with radical inbreeding and selection to get lines that were very, very genetically homogeneous, which you could then cross with each other to produce commercial hybrids, which through hybrid vigor, heterosis, were much more productive than the original pure lines. And therefore very commercially valuable. And similarly, people were producing pure line laboratory animals. If you have a strain of laboratory mice, which are all genetically very similar, so that there's no variation in the way their bodies work, and then you run an experiment on them, you can be sure that any variation in the outcome is due to the thing you're testing, not to the animals themselves. And so pure breeding in terms of lack of variation in the progeny came to be the new way that people were thinking about this parameter. And it was linked to Mendelism. And of course, these ideas began to seep into the dog fancy, and dog breeders also began to grapple with Mendelism. At first, not very competently, because this was such a radical idea. And if you're able to sort of skim through the contents of this article, you can see that this breeder, who's producing some breeding records that they think are compatible with Mendelism, isn't really very familiar with any of the concepts. They're deliberately not using any of the terminology, and the sort of attributes they're looking at are not all that Mendelian, we might argue. The point is that they're grappling with this new unfamiliar idea. And over the next few years, as Mendelism became more widely understood, this new paradigm of purity in terms of lack of variation began increasingly to influence the dog fancy. This was accompanied by influences from wider society, of course, ideas of class and race stratification that were unfortunately very common at that time. And together, these influences increasingly fed the idea that purebred dogs were inherently better than other dogs, that they'd been elevated above them by the process of selective breeding. And therefore, the purpose of registration gradually shifted from simply tracing dogs for the show ring to proving that they had been bred in this way within what we would call closed gene pools. And this drove a trend towards increasing levels of registration in the interwar years, so that we now enter a point where breed registries begin to be in transition from the fully open system to the closed system that we're familiar with today. And we can see this in the interwar archive in a variety of ways. So first of all, you see that crossbreeding is increasingly discouraged. So I've put here an image of an outcrossing protocol from 1925, where they've added a next generation in before you can consider the progeny purebred again and put them back on the breed register unmarked. They began to put more divisions between breeds. So, for example, dividing Cairns from Westies in 1925. And they began to provide pressure against those unregistered dogs from show lines that I mentioned earlier, in order to try to tighten up the registration system and by imposing a higher registration fee for dogs that had unregistered parents from 1935 onwards, therefore pushing people increasingly towards registration as the default. And you can see this process in this graph I've made of Pomeranian data during the interwar years. So one line here is, as you can see, the mirror image of the other. I've plotted dogs that had at least one unregistered parent against dogs that had both parents registered, which is the lighter line. And you can see that at the beginning of the period, just before the First World War, nearly 2/3 of them, as I've said before, had at least one unregistered parent, whereas by the time you conclude this graph in 1939, 90% of them have two registered parents. And the crossover for this breed was 1926. It varies a bit from breed to breed, but broadly speaking, the crossover is in the interwar years in all breeds. However, and this is, a surprise perhaps to those of you who haven't heard this before, the catalyst for change that finally firmly closed the first breed registry in the UK was canine health. And this happened because of a particular situation in Irish setters. So here you see a picture from about 1930 of the famous Irish setter kennel of the day called the Royal Kennel, owned by this formidable looking woman in the middle, Mrs. Ingle Beppler, who's holding her most famous stud dog, Riola Bryn. He was born in 1921, I think, and over the 1920s and the early 1930s, because inbreeding to good blood was the dominant paradigm for dog breeding, Irish setter breeders, particularly in the south of England, inbred heavily on Riola Bryn, so that by the early 1930s, a large number of these dogs were descended from Bryn repeatedly. Now, in 1931, this young man, Bill Rasbridge, got an Irish setter as a family pet. She was a young bitch who was the product of accidental brother-sister mating produced by Mrs. Ingle Beppler. And when she was this bitch was called Cleo. And when Cleo was about 6 months old, she began to go blind, which was obviously very sad. But Bill Rasbridge, he was a statistician professionally, but he'd done a degree at night school during which he had exposure to a great deal of information about Mendelian genetics. And he therefore very quickly thought that this could be due to an inherited disease, because this very young animal was the result of an incestuous mating and was potentially suffering from an inherited condition. And he made inquiries for 13 years. He made inquiries and traced pedigrees and realized that this dog was suffering from what they called night blindness, and we would now call our CD1 PRA, which he managed to trace back to Riola Bryn. Riola Bryn, in modern language, was a heterozygote for this condition, and because he had been bred from so heavily, it had spread throughout the breed, so that by the mid to late 1930s, there was a massive breed problem with PRA. But Rasbridge understood Mendelian heredity, and he therefore realised that you could divide dogs, if you could only tell them apart, into those that did or didn't carry the factor for night blindness, the allele for RCD1 PRA. And that because affected dogs went blind at a very young age, you could actually institute a policy of test mating, which was already used in agriculture, as long as the breed community would collaborate to identify which dogs these were. So this is where we need to remember to avoid presentism, because we, looking at this now today, are in a totally different position from these people at the time. So what they did was they deliberately took some blind dogs and mated unaffected dogs to them in order to establish whether these dogs would produce any blind puppies or not. Obviously, if the dog was an unaffected dog that was clear, then all the puppies would be heterozygotes and not blind themselves, whereas if the tested dog was a carrier, on average, 50% of them would be blind, and therefore you would be able to realise that that dog was not a clear dog to breed on from. And because Rasbridge was a statistician, he was able to tell them with confidence that if they got 6 clear puppies from a mating of this kind, there was only a 1 in 64 chance of a false negative, and that dog was probably identified as clear. Now, of course, today, we would regard the deliberate production of blind puppies as absolutely unethical. These people standing in 1945 had all lived through one world war very recently, just finished. The older ones had lived through 2 world wars. They were all undergoing rationing still at that time. They were in a mindset where distasteful, unpleasant things were necessary sometimes for the common good, and you just got on with it and dealt with it. And when you look at how these people discussed this in the archive at the time, there was pretty much no dissent. Once Rasbridge had managed to persuade them that this scheme would work, they basically rolled up their sleeves and got on with it, with almost nobody objecting to this plan. And you can see here, only a few months after they'd begun thinking about this, how in the adverts they were already, in the dog press, they were already deliberately complying with this scheme. You can see a dog advertised as test-mated, non-carrier of night blindness, somebody at the bottom responsibly saying that her dog's sired night blind puppies and she's withdrawing him from stud, and so on. And so, having gone to this massive effort to identify which dogs in the breed were clear from the disease and could be safely bred from, they did not want dogs without pedigrees muddying the waters and potentially reintroducing the disease. And therefore, in 1946, the Irish setter breed community petitioned the Kennel Club to close the breed register for reasons of health, in order to preserve the population as a closed gene pool going forwards, as we would say, which, once clear of the disease, would stay that way. And the scheme worked. They did clear the UK population of the disease, which I'll come back to in a minute. And so that's the context in which breed registry closure suddenly accelerated. So this graph is a bit spiky because what I did to get this data was look at a sample of dogs every 5 years from 1910 to 1970. But you can see, as I described earlier, across these 8 breeds, we start with just under 50% in total having 1 or more unregistered parents in 1910. There's a gradual falling off initially as registration begins to bite, a rapid falling off between 1925 and the outbreak of war, and then a very rapid fall off from 10% with 1 or both parents unregistered to very few between 1945 and 1950. And that's because this new culture, fed by the Irish setter case study, is really taking hold within the community. And so this is where we come to the period of actual registry closure. So the final steps to registry closure were very much led by people like Rasbridge, who were by this point in the 1960s no longer the young people dealing with the modern idea of Mendelism as they had been in the 1930s, but the senior leadership. And they consciously wanted to eliminate hybridism within dog breeds because of that pure line mentality that came from early to mid 20th century biology, as I described a few minutes ago. And there's this quote here from this poodle breeder, Norman Hinton: "Abnormalities which were inherited via recessive genes will be totally abolished if we get rid of hybridism. We want purebred dogs, not hybrids." Now, Norman Hinton, who was a friend of Rasbridge's, was also dealing with PRA and poodles. But unlike Rasbridge, he wasn't managing to get much traction with it, partly because biologically it was more challenging because the dogs didn't go blind at such a young age, and so you couldn't do test mating as effectively because you didn't know which dogs were going to develop the symptoms. But also, sorry, any poodle breeders who are listening, because the poodle breeders didn't cooperate. And so he was very much speaking from a perspective of we need to close breed registers to get a handle on disease if we possibly can, because these problems are eluding us. And so throughout the 1960s, there was a campaign to close what they saw as the back door to registration. They imposed an increased registration fee on dogs with unknown pedigree. And when the registers finally closed, which was not until the 1st of January 1971, this was very much framed as a triumph of genes over blood. And this was the default paradigm for the next 40 years. So there was the general climate of splitting linked breeds, as you see here, with fox terriers and chihuahuas split by coat type, for example. New breeds were, of course, often imported during this period, but when new breeds were recognised, such as border collies, the registers were only open for a short time before being firmly closed, and any exception routes that still existed were seldom used or authorised. But meanwhile, heredity moves moving on again because science moves onwards. And so by the 1980s, there was the rise of the concept of biodiversity and the importance of genetic diversity in conservation and in nature in 1980s academia. And this seeped into the dog world in the 1990s via the early internet. And any of you who were on the dog platforms at this time in the mid-1990s, as I was, will remember this sort of site, which is still available online as a sort of digital archaeology site. Dr. John Armstrong, who ran the Canine Diversity Project until his death in about 2001, but the pages are still up there. And so discussion in online forums of this sort before Facebook, before Instagram, was already beginning to recognise that genetic diversity was something that perhaps ought to be being applied to the dog world. And molecular genetics was also developing at this time, and it is no coincidence that the first gene test for an inherited monogenic disease in dogs was for RCD1 PRA in Irish setters, because ever since Rashbridge's work in the 1940s, Irish setter PRA had been a subject of research in various institutions in the UK and America, and this is what they came up with when the technology had moved on enough, leading to all the enormous advances in molecular genetics that benefit the dog world now. And as we move into this century, there are, of course, a whole host of new ideas feeding into the world. So we've got the increasing challenges from external campaigners concerned about pedigree dog health. Mainstream breeders are beginning to engage with genetic diversity. New tools such as coefficients of inbreeding are increasingly used, and outcrossing projects are beginning to be developed in other countries. I'm talking from sort of 2010-ish onwards. Which brings us to the present and then to the future. So the Kennel Club's current position is that, as most people listening will know, we accepted LUA, lower uric acid Dalmatians, which were technically the product of a 1970s American pointer outcross in 2010. And in 2011, we reintroduced the unverified parentage route, which has had limited usage since. We're currently developing administrative support for the International Leonberger Outcross Project, Leogen, and other outcrossing projects that are intended to promote genetic diversity or breed health would also be viewed favourably. Looking to the future, we currently have 2 major internal health team reviews in progress. My colleague, Dr. Joanna Ilska, is conducting a population genetics analysis, and I'm conducting a breed health and conservation plan impact review. And both of these include breed community focus group consultation and consider genetic diversity. So we can divide the issues with genetic diversity into 2 broad categories: support for maintaining or reducing loss of genetic diversity. And the sorts of areas that we're considering there are providing better pedigree data and online genetic tools, addressing the issues associated with popular sires, encouraging the breeding from individuals that are less closely related to the mainstream populations, and education and outreach, which are all areas that the breeders we've spoken to have said they would like support with. Increase in genetic diversity can, of course, only be achieved by obtaining genetic material that isn't already within the breed, within the registered breed. And the areas that we're going to be exploring here, with the involvement of breeds and led by the desires of breeds to a large extent, will be facilitating the unverified parentage route, supporting inter-variety breeding where relevant, so like between coat types and chihuahuas, for example, which we already permit, and organised outcrossing programmes, which are going to be very varied in what breeds need according to the issues that they face, but can potentially increase genetic diversity, as we see with Leogen, address heritable diseases, as with the LUA Dalmatians, or address conformational issues, as we see in some other countries already. So what can we learn from history as we come to the close of this presentation? There are some things that historical data can tell us and some things that it can't tell us. So you absolutely can trace pedigrees, as you see with this pedigree of Pekingese from the 1930s going back to Arkham. Obviously, there will be some errors in pedigree databases, whether accidental or deliberate, but by and large, this absolutely is a valid source of information. And you can look at Total Kennel Club registrations over time and notice trends that are due to social history, such as the World Wars, the registration system change that was temporarily introduced in the 1970s, and the pandemic. You can also look at trends in breed popularity over time. So here's an example here. I've plotted against that previous graph Pomeranians, which you can, as a percentage of total registrations, and you can see how massively popular they were in the Edwardian period and just up to the First World War, and how they have never regained such an enormous share of popularity since, which is partly, of course, simply because there are now a lot more breeds. But if you remember this graph of how closing breed registers have changed over time, that does affect how we interpret total registrations, because you're actually comparing apples at the beginning of this timeline with oranges at the end. The graph is not measuring the same thing across the whole of its length, because the beginning of this line is looking at show populations and the end is looking at closed breed registers and total populations within them. So what can and can't we do with historical data? Pedigree information is valid. You can explore social trends in data. You can examine breed trends over time. But the early registrations, say largely pre-World War II, is different because it reflects total show entries, not total population size, and therefore to a large extent is a different type of data for population genetics work, although this will vary by breed. In a breed which never really had a large pet population, when pretty much all the dogs were in the show ring, that obviously wouldn't apply. So as we end our field trip, what have we learned about these common current beliefs about dog breeding history? So have pedigree dog breed registers always been closed? Absolutely not. They were originally fully open and were introduced to track show or field trial entries, not pedigrees, and registry closure happened gradually much later. There really isn't any doubt about that. That is false presentism. Current pedigree dog breeding practices date from Victorian times. Well, not really. So pedigree dog breeding practices have changed repeatedly over time. Obviously, there are some common elements, but closed registers date from the mid-20th century, not earlier, and it is from a presentist perspective that they have been retrofitted onto the Victorian era when they actually weren't a thing then. And they're still undergoing change today. The practices of today are not the same as the practices of 10 or 20 or 40 years ago. So this is also false presentism. Pedigree dog breeding was based on inbreeding because these breeders didn't care about health. Well, human nature doesn't change. Of course, there always have been and doubtless always will be some people with other priorities. There will be people who are more concerned about winning in the show ring or about making money or about power. But inbreeding was often because they did care about health, particularly in the mid-20th century, when biologists were recommending pure line breeding for exactly that reason, pure line breeding in the lack of variation sense. And yet inbreeding is obviously also been known all the way through to be a cause of disease, and that's the paradox. So when we're thinking about this, we really have to think about where we're standing in time, because why breeders did what they did at different time points really depends on where they were in history, why they were motivated to take those actions. Finally, dog breeders resist change and don't care about science. Well, I think I've shown that new ideas in dog breeding have always followed new science, although obviously sometimes with a time lag to adoption. And of course, people vary. There are always going to be some people that resist change in any sector. But over time, most responsible breeders, like those Irish setter breeders, have engaged with new concepts where they've seen their value. And so this is also mostly false presentism, or more or less presentism, though it may be talking really more about the present as well. So as I finish, what next? I've deliberately left this slide mostly blank for two reasons. One is that one of the things I want to achieve through this webinar is to open a space for us to talk about these things, using history as a tool to maybe overturn some people's previous expectations a bit, and open this forum for discussion about going forwards, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. This is a time of real transition for dog breeding, not just in the UK, but globally, in all sorts of ways that I won't need to explain to anybody listening. But we can't change the past. We can be informed by it, but we can change what happens in the future by the actions we collectively take today. And if history can be a tool to help us do that, then it's a really useful thing to be studying and bring to the debate. Thank you for your time. Please don't share the images elsewhere. Thanks so much to the Kennel Club Library and Art Gallery staff. I couldn't have done my research without you. And I'm really looking forward to questions. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alison. Really, really appreciate that. We're going to jump straight into some questions. So we've got some pre-submitted questions. Anybody is welcome to put a question in the Q&A feature if you're able to. You're happy to go in there and add your question, then we can have a look at that. So, and we've had a question. Do you have any suggestions on how the tension between breeders who wish to preserve the purity, the word exactly quoted, of their breeds and the need to increase genetic diversity can be achieved?
So you have to take people with you. And I think one of the strong arguments for talking about the history is that it isn't typically what people think it is, that breed registers have not always been closed and that purity used to be understood in a different way. So if there is a strong argument for promoting genetic diversity and taking a different approach to breeding, then tapping into the history is a way of showing people that things haven't always been done in the same way and that perhaps it might be sensible to consider a different way of doing things. But these conversations have to be had, I think, with breed communities because they are not all facing the same problems and they certainly don't all need the same solutions. So it's more a way of opening up conversations by, as I said at the end, maybe just changing people's mindsets a bit to think about things in a different way. And I think that can be a useful tool for meeting people where they are and thinking about solutions collaboratively.
Okay, thank you. And at what point should a vulnerable breed be considering outcrossing as a potential way forward? Or do you want to say anything really about outcrossing as a tool for vulnerable breeds? I know you touched on it in the presentation.
Well, I mean, this is something that's really also, sitting under Joanna, obviously, as the geneticist. Outcrossing is something that I think breeds should be considering when there is a need for it. Whether a breed is vulnerable or not is going to depend partly on its global status. Because if a breed is very small population in one country, but there's more of it in another country, then that's an obvious place to look first. And also on what problems it faces. And there are all sorts of strategies, both within and without a breed population, that can be called upon to deal with challenges that a breed may be facing. So again, I think those are conversations that very much need to be had with a breed community, because in most cases, the breed does know what problems they're facing and are very aware, we found in our conversations, of what sort of challenges they would like to deal with, and that will very much affect what those solutions might be. But we're certainly looking, as a result of the reviews that we're currently doing, to develop strategies that will be able to support breed communities that are looking to engage with that sort of process. And we know that definitely some of them are interested in that in this country as they are in other countries. So I think that will be an avenue of work going forwards.
Some of these questions that I've got, but I'm going to come on to one that is particularly interested in the requirements of breeds historically moving between breed register and import register. I don't know whether you want to say anything about those two types of register or anything you can add on from the presentation.
I don't, I'm not specifically familiar with exactly what those criteria were. I mean, if you look at 150 years of breed history, of a pedigree dog history, there are all sorts of changes in rules and regulations and types of registry system that have come and gone during that time. It's not always very accessible to see exactly what the rules and regulations were at any particular point. So I don't specifically know that without checking. If you would like to know, then contact Kira Farrell in the Kennel Club library, because she will know. She's a mine, whoever asked that question, she's a mine of information on this sort of thing, and she would be able to give you the answer to that question, but I can't without looking it up or asking her.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat about COIs and how they're calculated, but I've actually asked Joanna to come back on that one because it's a little bit of a nuanced, detailed question, and therefore we want to make sure we give you the full answer. So Joanna will come back on that one. There's also a question just a little bit more about the Leogen project and any other information we can share. I think there's some curiosity about that project and obviously the work that Breed have done, but potentially want to divert that to those knowledgeable colleagues in that area, such as Sharon. But anything you want to say on that, Alison?
Well, no, I mean, we're very much taking a supporting role here. So all we're really doing is developing appropriate tools to register the dogs that the Leogen project people are producing as they get the scheme going. So for those who don't know, it's an international project led by Leonberger breeders to perform a controlled multi-dog outcrossing enterprise to bring and maintain increased genetic diversity into the breed while still maintaining the characteristics of the breed that the enthusiasts love. And so they've identified a number of outcrossed dogs of different types in different places. This is running across a number of countries and using what we will be calling development registers as a place to register the dogs that are outcrossed for a number of generations before they're brought back into the breed register, with various sort of safeguards around it in terms of health testing for inherited disease and so on. But this is very much us supporting them. It's an amazing effort that they've been putting a lot of very careful thought into for a long time. You know, I very much admire the way they've gone about this because they have really thought about it very carefully to give it the best chance of success. And I think it is just getting underway at the moment, I believe. So there should be more news on that shortly.
Thank you. We have a question that asks, is it true that firstly they registered the show results registry was only males? Question about the stud book. I don't know whether I'm asking you questions you'll know the answer to, or we're going to divert a lot of queries to Kira in the library. But do you know if it was only males and that's why they called it the stud book?
No, I'm sure. I mean, that's a really good question, actually. I'm sure it wasn't. I'm sure I've literally got the first volume in the other room. I could nip out and check. But no, I don't think so. I think it was both sexes from the outset.
Perfect. Okay.
I'll be so embarrassed if that wasn't the case.
Comments, emails, and complaints to help
at the exactly.
.org.uk. Okay, we've got another question here.
I think it was called the stud book because they were trying to emulate thoroughbred horse breeding. That's why. So I don't think it was anything to do with sex.
Perfect. Are there processes, now this is definitely in your area, Alison, are there processes, strategies that the Kennel Club provides to support breed clubs find scientific information publications as such to address challenges their breed is facing? If so, how does a breed club get considered or support for this?
Yes. So we have breed health coordinators for each breed who are volunteers from the breed community, who are our main point of liaison with the breed community. And we have a support network for those that runs occasional events, such as we're having a face-to-face day meeting in September, for example, with them. And we're available for sort of email advice on an ongoing basis. But the main scientific sort of interface we have is the breed health and conservation plans, which have been going since 2016, which are basically a document for each breed that gathers the scientific evidence to describe the health profile of that breed. So it takes information from a number of sources. Obviously, for a breed where there's a lot of published data in scientific papers, it's relatively easy to get a handle on a breed's disease profile. But we also look at things like insurance data, publications such as the Royal Veterinary College's Vet Compass work, and breed health surveys that the breed communities do themselves, for example, and use all that to talk through with breeds what their health priorities should be. And then where there are clinical or DNA health tests that are relevant to a breed, you can find those in the Kennel Club's new health standard, which is on the website, which give guidelines for good and best practice for each breed of what we think that every breeder should be doing, and those breeders who are aiming for the higher standard should be doing. So good is meant to be entry level for any breeder that's trying to do a decent job, and best practice is what those who are trying to do the best job possible should be doing. Obviously, not every disease has a clinical or DNA screening test, but where those are available, they're in the health standard. And all of this is currently under revision with the reviews that I've mentioned and on an ongoing basis. So there are going to be more changes and developments in the pipeline over the next year or two. But we very much try to run, well, I mean, Charlotte runs it, not me, she's my boss, but we very much try to run a supportive and transparent and open health team. So if anybody has a question, then email us and one of us will get back to you.
Great. We have a question, a very good question. Is there anything to be learned from history about whether or not the Kennel Club should start to recognise, is the word we've used here, some of the so-called designer breeds? Anything you want to say in this space, Alison?
So yes, I will speak personally here because I think that's the best thing to do on this occasion. That I think that we as the Kennel Club and I as an individual should care about the welfare of all dogs, and that an organisation that is trying to provide traceability on canine health should be able to provide traceability on canine health right across the spectrum. How you would go about doing that without compromising the other things that are also of value to the community is another question. But I do think that it's not right to not support people who are trying to breed dogs responsibly, whatever dog it is that they're trying to breed, because there is value in an organisation that is independent, that holds records and has a database that can be tapped into by multiple people and is transparent in the way it holds the data, which is something that I think it would be helpful for anybody who's trying to do a good dog breeding job to be able to access. But that's me speaking personally.
Thank you. There's been a question come in, and I think this is a really, really interesting debate, and I'd love to get a lot of breeders on a call and kind of watch this unfold. But from your perspective, would you pick genetics over construction? Can you separate those two things out, I would say? Any comments and thoughts on that one?
Blimey. That's a question, isn't it?
For a focus group, yeah.
Yeah, goodness. Well, I mean, construction is the result of genetics, isn't it? Um, I don't judge. I can't say I've ever shown, I have shown dogs, but I'm terrible at it. I trip over the dogs. So I'm not really a person with expertise in that area at all. I think that they are probably complementary to a large extent. Obviously, there's some overlap in that there are some aspects of construction that are directly attributable to genetics in a way we understand. But I think in the world that we live in at the moment, probably by and large, they provide what you can see by looking at a dog in most cases is different than what you would find out by considering the genetics of a dog in the world that we live in today. In that we still don't have a perfect understanding of the way in which most traits are inherited. Yes, we've got this great long list of monogenic disorders that we can track, but even things like hip construction, we don't really understand the genetics of all that well, I think it's fair to say. And although there are certain aspects of the conformation of brachycephalic dogs, for example, that are attributable to certain genes, there's still a lot that is a matter of an eye for a dog, isn't it? So I think that using both what you can see and what you can determine by science, be that genetics or other screening tests, is the best balance in using all the sources of information that are available to you to make the best breeding choices you can.
Absolutely. So there's some comments about kind of practices in other countries, but also there's a question that came in beforehand about the unverified registration routes. And the ease of use of unverified registration and whether the Kennel Club is looking at this. And then there's also a question that's come in a similar way about types of registration and reintroducing the open registry. So I don't know if there's any other comments to build on the presentation about our work in this area.
Yes, so we're literally looking at the unverified parentage route at the moment because although, as I said in the presentation, we have had the unverified route since 2011, it's not very accessible. Interestingly, and this is a bit of a side detail, but the price hasn't changed since the 1960s. It cost £100 to add an unverified dog to the register then, and it still does. So that's one thing where inflation has not been a consideration. And it's much more of a bargain now than it was then. But although the route is available, it's not something that we have historically, I mean, since 2011 historically, particularly promoted or facilitated. And I think it's probably fair to say that people have needed to be quite motivated to use it. And we definitely want to make that more accessible going forwards when people want to add dogs to breed registers in order to improve genetic diversity or address other health issues. And so we're looking at how we can do that. I mean, at the moment, it's not even got a dedicated page on the website. So there's plenty that we could obviously do to raise the profile and encourage people to be aware that that route is available. In terms of opening breed registers more broadly, well, this is obviously something that's going to evolve as time goes on to some extent, but I think unverified parentage route is certainly the way forward to start with, because it does provide some degree of traceability of what's going on while giving that bit of flexibility that the system's effectively lacked for the last few years.
Perfect. I think that's the final note, really. Watch this space. In this whole area. I want to make a couple of points. Firstly, thank you so much to Alison for doing this. I have the privilege of working with you and tapping into this knowledge and expertise, but to be able to share that with a much wider group of people is brilliant. This webinar will be available at no cost on the Kennel Club's YouTube channel. It's really, really easy to access. We have a playlist of health webinars, all of which you can access. Please do share them on social media or with your friends or those in the community. It's really, really a valuable resource, and we want as many people as possible to have access to it. If a question that was very, very specific and you don't feel that we answered you, please do come to us at health@thekennelclub.org.uk. If we cannot answer your question, I will commit to you now that we will find somebody at the Kennel Club who will answer your question for you. We're not able to cover everything that's really, really nuanced and specific here, but hopefully we've answered a lot this evening and given you all a lot to think about. Please do also provide your feedback. We want to continue to grow the health webinars. We want to know what topics you're interested in, what you want to hear about. So it's really, really vital to us that you do complete feedback. And again, drop us an email with any questions or thoughts or feedback, and complete the feedback route that we provide. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you all have a peaceful and restful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.